Welcome, everyone, to the third in what will now, one hopes, be an established and regular program of ACS talks on the history, statistics, culture, and even the politics of our beautiful game. A few items of housekeeping. First and most important, a very happy 37th birthday to me. I don't think I look a day over 60. Second, please all put yourselves on mute, at least until the Q&A section. And finally, do send your feedback on this event and your suggestions for future events. That would include those of you who would like to address such events yourself, to Hugh Nathan, our membership secretary, from whom you will have received your Zoom link. I must say that when we were approached with the idea for this one, I was a little apprehensive. I had never previously heard of baseball's wins above replacement model, and the word sabermetrics filled me with an eldritch terror. But the turnout tonight, which is growing by the second, I've got a few people to admit at the end of my remarks, really speaks volumes for our membership, for its curiosity and its serious-mindedness. No doubt you all know our speaker, but a few words of introduction wouldn't be amiss. Russ Houldin, or Houldin as he tells me it's actually pronounced, is a retired Ontario public servant with almost 50 years involvement in the renewable energy sector, as well as 30 years experience as an adjunct professor and sessional instructor at the University of Toronto. He has taught environmental courses at Innis College, the Centre for Environment, and most recently, the School of the Environment. He has an undergraduate degree in chemistry from the University of Bristol and graduate degrees in environmental studies and economics, both from York University. You will all know him, of course, as editor of the ACS Journal, in which capacity last month he put together a thoroughly eclectic and readable edition. So without further ado, then, let me hand over to Russ. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Rodney, and many thanks for putting this together. And I should also give a special shout out to Jeremy Lonsdale, whose help has been enormously great in getting to this point. Just very briefly, if I think I get the history right, I sent a suggestion to Jeremy that to make a book out of a couple of articles that I'd written, and so Jeremy suggested do an outline. So I did an outline and then a book length proposal. And so Jeremy suggested that, sort of given the kind of unusual nature of the proposal, we should do this seminar to give people a better idea of what it was about. Obviously, the general idea is that to evaluate the whole cricketer, there's an equivalence principle, which is that a run scored by a batsman is equivalent to a run saved by a bowler, is equivalent to a run avoided by a fielder. There are many ways existing to evaluate bats and bowlers separately, and I won't go into detail on that. All-rounders have always presented a difficulty. I would just mention in passing, it so happens that I got an article in the forthcoming issue, the May issue of the journal, as a very interesting proposal for all-rounders. But I believe baseball provides a model for looking at the whole cricketer, not just batsmen or bowlers separately or all-rounders separate from those, but to look at the entire contribution of a cricketer. The methods that I'm going to go through are not intended to be definitive, but complementary to these other approaches. And the big hope in getting the ball rolling with this is to get others interested, to shape the idea into something equivalent to baseball would take far more work than I would be able to muster. And also to get my interest is Test cricket, and I focused on Test cricket. But I would hope to get white ball enthusiasts involved for a reason that I think will become apparent as we move through the presentation. And then finally, just as a general approach that I take to evaluation, is that statistics can start the conversation about merit, but not end it. So this is what inspired me to come up with this. Is Very briefly, I moved to North America in the 70s, and while I never lost interest in cricket, I also became enamored of baseball. Over time, I looked at the developing literature on baseball analytics. This is largely goes under this name sabermetrics. What's been very interesting for me to observe over all these years is how these new analytics, as they're called, have actually entered the mainstream. The baseball always had a lot of statistics. I won't go into them in any detail, but this idea of wins above replacement has now actually entered the mainstream. Some of you may be aware of the book Moneyball and the subsequent movie, which talked about how it's actually being used to select team rosters in Major League Baseball. So again, it starts with the idea of runs are created by hitters and they're saved by pitchers and fielding. And these can be put on the same scale. A run created by the hitter is just as much value to the team as a run saved by a pitcher. Now, this is all relative to this idea of a replacement player. When we say runs created or saved, this is in terms of putative replacement player from the era in which they play. As I say, that then gives you a standard that you can apply certainly within eras, and then there's also a whole debate about whether you can cross eras, which we'll also get into. There is an ongoing controversy in baseball that what negative values mean when you do this comparison. I think when we start to talk about cricket, I don't think it's as much as a controversy, but I'm just sort of flagging that. So then we start this idea of runs created or saved, and then we convert that into a win contribution, essentially by a long run statistical analysis of what the value of a run is in terms of team wins. And of course, in the case of baseball, there are no draws. And so there's a very rich database for people doing statistical analysis to say, like, what's the incremental value of a run in terms of whether it will generate a win for a team. So that's how we get from runs created or saved to a win, and the idea of wins above replacement. Now, you may or may not know that there are major leagues and minor leagues in baseball, and the minor leagues basically act as feeders for the major league. So the notion is that any given player could be replaced by someone from coming up from the minor league. So that obviously isn't something we can use directly in cricket. What I've converted it to is what its practical meaning is, which is averages. So an average hitter in the minor leagues could replace a second baseman or a first baseman in the major league if they just improve their average a little bit. As you'll see, that's my proposal for cricket, is that we use batting and bowling averages from an individual player's era as the standard against which to say these are replacement players. I'll get into that in more detail in the next slide. As I mentioned, wins above replacement has become now the gold standard for measure of player performance. There are competing definitions. I've given one example. People differ on how you could do era adjustments. Obviously, it allows you to rate pitchers and hitters against the same standards, and you'll see long published lists of both. But one final comment, which I think is fairly pertinent, is baseball and cricket compared to a lot of other sports are very stochastic. That is to say, the same event occurs over and over and over again. Obviously, with some differences, but basically we have, in a good career, a bowler and a batter might deliver or face some upwards of 100,000 balls. So that's what I'm referring to in the stochastic nature. And it's the same with baseball. They probably even larger number of pitches that are thrown and received. So that makes, I think, just as a general overview, makes both sports very conducive to statistical analysis. So this is how I propose to apply this to cricket. So we would look at the runs made by bats relative to their era, and this is the key point, per team innings. This involves a very straightforward use of batting averages. When we look at bowlers, it's a little more complicated, but it's the same concept. Runs saved by bowlers relative to their era, again, per team innings. And of course, normally the bowling average is the average runs per wicket taken. So if we're going to put it on the same basis as a batsman, we have to create a way of putting them on the same basis, which is a team innings. innings, which is essentially per 10 outs. Now, my sampling suggests that run outs represent only 0.2 average dismissals per team inning. So it would be in the calculations that I'm going to show you later, I assume that there are 9.8 bowler dismissals per team inning. And then the individual bowler contribution is given by the difference between the bowler's average and the era average per wicket multiplied by the average wickets taken by a bowler in a team innings. So a bowler might take 25% of the innings, which would be, of course, 0.25 outs per innings. So in that way, the bowler and the batter are put on the same basis as what is the value to their team of either creating a run or saving a run, again, relative to the era average. Now, the bit that I've included and is a bit speculative, but I think is worth putting on the table, is that I think we can also, following baseball, bring fielding into this as well. Now, what I'm presenting today is, I admit, is very incomplete, but it's something that could eventually get us towards a more complete system, such as they have in baseball. Sort of mentioned earlier, for red ball, there's no equivalent to wins above replacement because of draws. So for white ball cricket, it would be perfectly feasible to term runs created, saved, and avoided into wins. And so that's something I hope to get the interest of people who follow white ball cricket. Now, in what tables I'm going to show in a few minutes, these use approximations. And so, again, this is part of why I'd very much like to get people interested in the overall technique to go beyond approximations. The inspiration for me came from some work by someone called Zahir Clark, who did a decade-by-decade analysis of test cricket averages. Subsequently, ESPN has also reported an analysis they did, not decade-by-decade, but by 100 test units. And what they suggest is that the averages have been very stable after 1920. It still means it's a challenge before 1920, but as you'll see when you look at the tables I'll present, I've just made some as a replacement concept these long run averages. I've also only used top order bats and tail end bats. Obviously, what you should do is actually by position. There is a system out there, I believe, that could actually rectify this. This is Rick Finley's ERA system that he wrote an article in issue 200. I don't think he's followed up with that, but he has a database and a system that could move beyond the approximations that I'm going to show you today. And then I've obviously some of the approximations are average number of runouts. The bowler shares are done by a rough approximation, not by the exact number that apply to each bowler. As a test, I did it for two bowlers, Imran Khan and Richard Hadley. I actually went through the whole careers and then saw whether their actual share of wickets was what I was using by my rule of thumb method, and they're pretty close. Extras are a problem. It's over the years, the extras have been treated differently. In the tables I'll be showing you in a few minutes, I've just simply not try to address that issue. It would require more research than I've done on the composition of extras and which ones are attributed to bowlers and not to bowlers. And then finally, all-rounders do pose a bit of a problem in that you have to decide whether an all-rounder is really a batter who bowls as well, or a bowler who's pretty useful as a bat, or an actual, quotes, all-rounder. What that boils down to is using a different reference replacement average, and you'll see that concretely in a little while. Yeah, so as I mentioned, the really big gap in cricket relative to baseball is in fielding and wicket keepers. Without going into a lot of detail, over the years, sabermetricians have done a lot of work on adjusting basic runs created and runs saved, and then WAR in terms of factors like the size of ballparks, the changes to the baseball itself, the height of the pitching man. But most important is that baseball has very long run records of errors, fielding errors, which we don't have in cricket. It's very anecdotal, and they've also gone beyond that to what they call range factors, because errors don't give you the whole story. There are some fielders who simply get to balls that other fielders wouldn't get to. They may commit an error, but in other instances they would have made a catch that the slower fielders wouldn't have met. So again, this is sort of part of the baseball landscape that could eventually try to incorporate. So a tentative suggestion for fielding, and it is very tentative, is that I'm assuming the long run average wicket is 30 runs, and it turns out that the catch share of dismissals is about 60%. So in other words, 18 runs, a catch then is worth 18 runs, and then a player value is then relative to what the average player would make in the way of catches. So you see, I use the again from just doing some sampling, the average number of catches per innings made by the average fielder is 0.6, and then for a wicket keeper it's 2, and so I use those to come up with a run equivalent for fielders. How do then deal with runs saved or allowed by good fielding or misfielding would require some kind of retrospective analysis, but is worth thinking about. So turning to the results of this, I take a general approach that, so even though I'm using quantitative methods, I recognize right away that they're not that precise. So I use an analogy of beauty. While it's in the eye of the beholder, social psychological studies have shown that people can more or less group images of people or scenery, a consensus about what's a higher level beauty than the lower level, and so on. So again, this is the idea that the approach is indicative but not rigorous. Hopefully it illustrates the potential of this approach of the whole cricketer versus separating out the type batters from bowlers and from all-rounders. So what I've done is, having a little bit of fun, is I've got 4 main groups, what I call the Helen of Troy group, Eleanor of Aquitaine group, Countess Josephine, and Lady Hamilton. The last 2 coming from, there's a George Formby song called If Women Like Men Like Those, Why Don't Women Like Me? And these are the Countess Josephine and Lady Hamilton are sort of 2 exemplars in that song. So I've looked at the top 100 cricketers. In contrast to the draft that I've circulated, I decided not to include current players. The selection criteria also impose some constraint. I chose 25 test matches, excluded people who had less than 25 test matches. In terms of batting averages below 48 weren't looked at, and bowling averages above 25. These make a material difference, and I'll give some examples of how that works. But these are inevitable problems when you do statistics-based comparisons. So no big surprise. Bradman contributes 64 runs on average, more runs per team innings than the average cricketer, which, when you think about it, is quite extraordinary. When the average innings is 300 runs, and Bradman is contributing 64 runs more than an average player out of that 300. Right. So you'll see the first column is the reference batting average, and so this is an area, if you like, of judgment right there. So I've taken for all bats, and it's displayed for Bradman, for top order batsmen, all top order batsmen. That's actually batsmen 1 through 6 to be 36. Bradman's, of course, famous average is 100, so his contribution per team innings is 64 runs. We go to the next one, Richard Hadley. I class him as a bowler who bats, and we'll see why this becomes important when we look at some all-rounders. His batting average is 27, so his contribution as a bat only is 7 runs per innings more than the average player. When we turn to the bowling, again, the reference average is 30, 30. His bowling average is 22. So he's better than the average bowler by 8 per wicket. To convert that into a team innings, we just look at his share of team outs, which in this case is quite high, is 33%. So overall, he's contributing 26 runs saved per innings relative to an average bowler. And then when we combine his batting with his bowling, you see that Hadley, his contribution, average contribution is 33 runs per innings over a replacement or average Richard Hadley. So Davidson is in the same category. So we go to Imran Khan. So his reference bat average is 30. Which is what I'm taking as being the average for an all-rounder, as I say, against all cricketers. Khan's average is higher than that. As a bowler, we do the same thing, and so his total is 28 runs contributed for his team per innings compared to the average cricketer. If he was treated as like Hadley, of course that number gets much higher. So this is part, I think, of the judgment that has to be made when you look at individual cricketers. The next one is S.F. Barnes, and so here you'll see, because of the era he was in now, before 1920, the averages are not stable. So I really just had to kind of pick a number for Barnes, both as a batsman and as a bowler. And so when we obviously it says this, of course, famously low 16 runs per wicket, but rather than against 30 runs per wicket on the average in his era, I'm estimating that it's compared to 24. So his net difference is 8, but he has his share of wickets is off the scale. As Mueller-Ridderin is close to him, but 46% of the wickets taken is huge, which altogether gives him a score of 36 as a bowler. But because he was a poor batsman, his overall score is 28. So that one of the issues in taking the whole cricketer approach is bowlers bat, some batters also bowl, and you have to look at both components. So I think that's an unusual feature of this approach. People are more used to just looking at bowlers and batsmen without considering that they play both roles. The other big issue is what I call occasional bowlers, people like Joe Root, Walter Hammond, Ted Dexter. I've used, again, arbitrary cutoff of 50 wickets. Anyone who took more than 50 wickets, I've gone to the trouble of analyzing them. Rigorously, I should actually do everybody. Even Bradman bowled a few. Actually, I looked at Bradman. If you do the same analysis with Bradman, it makes no difference because his share of wickets is so small. But it's an issue that shouldn't be swept under the rug. So I think that's kind of a rundown on how the calculation is done. So I guess what I'm saying is those there, you could pick up pretty much anyone other than Bradman from that group and make a case for them being the next best to Bradman. As we go down to the next group, the similar sort of reasoning. Anyone within that group is more or less the same, although obviously people could start to make arguments for why they ought to be included in the higher group. On the left there, I've broken it down by country, and there it's so Australia comes out on top. So what we've got is the percentage of Australians in the top 100 is 27% compared to the share of tests in which Australian batsmen have played. So there's a ratio there of 1.6, and so on for the other countries. I'd say on the whole that's not so bad. But when we look at the eras, there's a considerable imbalance. The representation in the top 100 is heavily weighted towards the early eras. For the most recent one, 2000 to 2025, if you include current players, that number goes up a fair bit, probably doubles. So there's obviously a question here: are we really doing a fair comparison, or is this actually representative of what we might call great cricketers has changed over the years. All-rounders versus bowlers who bat well is a judgment call. I mentioned occasional bowlers. I didn't mention the distribution of within that top 100, 57 are bowlers, 43 bats, and of which of the 57 bowlers, eight are might call genuine all-rounders. This analysis seems to be biased towards the contribution of bowlers to a degree. I also did a quick comparison with Jared Kimber's recent book on the art of batting. So he looked at batsmen only. So I looked at the batsman that's in my top 100. There's a large overlap, but the rankings are very different. Now, he hedges his bet. I don't know if you've read the book, but he gives a range of ranking positions. So he's moving towards this beauty group, I think, as well. But it suggests that the approach is, well within what you would intuitively think are good rankings. Okay, so some of the controversial issues, again, whole cricketer versus bowler, batsman, all-rounder, raises the issue of, in particular with all-rounders, of how you treat them, and then the idea of, I think what was unfamiliar, the idea that bowlers' contribution has to take into account how well they bat. One issue that I've flagged in the draft, I might be too controversial, like other elements of the draft I'd be willing to take out, is it struck me that the Pakistan records before neutral umpires are very controversial. Players who have records in Pakistan are wildly different from their away records, and I think that presents a sort of a general problem. As I said, I've taken out current players for the time being. My criteria for even doing the analysis results in some excluded notables. Harold Lyrewood only had 21 tests, so he's not included. I've listed a number of others here. The 48 batting average excludes a lot of good players. I've sort of listed those here. Same with bowling average. So the great James Anderson doesn't really even figure in the analysis. He's above what I've taken as the benchmark. And then I mentioned the occasional bowlers, and then I would just quickly mention Sobers. If any of you read one of my original articles, one of the things that has motivated my amateur work over the years was in effect to try to come up with some rationale for saying Sobers was the greatest cricketer ever. And as I mentioned in that article, I basically failed to do that. The special consideration that I throw on the table for him is that his versatility is a factor that's, I think, unique to him. What I would suggest for Sobers is you should consider him as two players, a spinner or a medium fast bowler, and that this is a genuine advantage he conferred on his team, so that his value is not just the value that I calculated, which is in the 20s sometimes, something like that, but double that. And that gives me some succor towards putting Sobers in the next category to Bradman. When I add catching, keeping results, there's no consistent data on errors. I've done a whole analysis of how the rankings change when you include catching. But it would need a lot of work, because there's obvious, as I say, the catches alone are not a good measure. Clive Lloyd doesn't rank particularly high. He was an outstanding fielder. So a measure of fielding that doesn't get Clive Lloyd right is not, it needs some work, let's say. And similarly with Jack Hobbs. And then in the keepers, Gilchrist, from using 2 catches per innings compared to how many catches Ilchrist took, his value leaps up enormously to 25 runs created or avoided from 14 for catches alone. There's no analysis of buys, there's no analysis of stumpings, so a lot of work would be needed. Because it was actually W.G. Grace. W. Grace vaults up into the top category when you take catches into account. These are factors that there are many arguments about. The way I generally class this is that people who might have ideas of how you can adjust the records that we have, the pure records we have for runs and batting and bowling averages, these are the kind of factors that you see people talking about. People who have ideas of how you should adjust batting and bowling averages, these sorts of factors could be incorporated in the overall approach that I've laid out here. My general bias as someone who's spent a lot of time doing statistics is to take the straightforward standard statistical approach, and that is that there's given large number of observations, you get regression to the mean. In other words, the Gaussian or normal distribution applies, and if these things were, if you like, that obvious, they would show up in the long run average. And they don't. I have a couple of charts, the ones I mentioned from Zahir Clark and from ESPN, which shows that over time the average test runs per wicket has been very stable at essentially around 30. Okay, I think we're into the last slide now. This was more for fun. You can do things like do a what if, is using the values that you can get from my method to look at the Australian Invincibles versus the West Indies under Lloyd and Richards. You can add it up and see who would likely come on top. My analysis suggests that it would actually be the Invincibles, but there are some notable sample size issues there. In other words, quite a number, like people like Barnes didn't meet the 25 test average, and various other players. So you have to put a big caveat on that. And the other is Bradman alone makes an enormous difference. Again, with his 64 runs on average, more than the average player. In conclusion, as I said here, I acknowledge all kinds of refinements might be needed, but I think there's a valuable approach here in that everybody could be measured with an intuitive value. It's not some kind of index. It's the sum of runs contributed, saved, and avoided per team innings relative to your averages. You could use that to look at the whole cricketer. Three elements to this: players compared to relative to the era adjustments, and runs created equivalent to runs avoided or saved. Again, mentioning that the fielding approach is very undeveloped. I hope to get others interested. Ideally, we could move forward with a book on this. Again, there'd be no suggestion that the ACS is endorsing this, and I recognize I don't think there's other publications like it, but I think it would be something that would work well under the imprimatur of the ACS. So, anyhow, thank you very much for listening, and I hope to hear your questions.
Well, I suppose I have one, which is a factor I don't think is too often considered when we're evaluating all-time greats. We talk about differences of conditions and eras. Something that's always struck me as a major factor, but which I don't think many have spotlighted, is the factor of selection. Some players were elevated too early to their national sides, and their early struggles can have an undue weight in their overall statistics, certainly compared with those whose selection was perfectly timed. And then, of course, there are others whose purple patches were better and longer than otherwise superior-looking careers. I'd cite, for example, Imran Khan, who I think for the last 40 tests of his career averaged with the bat plus 50 and with the ball about 20. Just extraordinary. On that basis, I'd suggest that sometimes looking at the whole cricketer is less good an idea than looking only at part of the cricketer, if you follow me.
Yeah, actually, I didn't dwell on this, but in the book draft, I went into some detail in terms of addressing that in two ways. One, again, it's just a starting point. I really think you have to look at other so this would be this rating that I showed you is just a starting point. You have to look at a whole host of other factors to make a proper determination of who was better than whom. So that's a general point, but more addressed to your question itself. And this is something that's again, you see a lot of pages devoted to this in the baseball literature, is career versus peak. And you other people talk about this in terms of other sports as well. So you look at the peak of a player or the whole career. What's the relevant relevant comparison. Don't think there's a definitive answer to that. I think that's always going to be a matter of debate. I mean, in cricket, also, just again, the vagaries of selection. I mean, one of my pet peeves, and maybe Stephen Swain thinks, be interesting what Stephen thinks, but it's Ken Higgs. Is like Ken Higgs should have played for England more often, but he didn't, and so he doesn't even show up on my table. So that's aside from your point, which is that people move through their career differently, and some would have done better if they weren't introduced to the test team earlier in the career, and so on. All of those, I think, are like valuable debates. And again, my overall approach is let the statistics be the starting point. It's not the end point.
We have a couple of questions that I hadn't previously noted from Tom, so let
Yeah,
me read them out to you. The
yeah.
first one says, as I can't speak due to lack of a mic, I wonder if we really can do anything with fielding. The
Right.
method that is suggested must prioritize those who field close in while not benefiting those boundary fielders who are great at saving one. They are in more of a position to take a catch.
I absolutely agree that that's the way a proper fielding analysis should be done should be by position, just as batsmen should be evaluated by position, not just as I did top order versus lower order. And again, in fact, that's what we find in baseball. Baseball, they have certain fielding positions: first base, second base, third base, shortstop, right field, left field, center field, catcher, and the pitcher fields as well. So they're all rated in terms of the third base versus third base and so on. And for sure, cricket should be the same thing. You're obviously not, close fielders get more opportunity to catch than outfielders and so on. So that's just something again I put under the heading of let's put it on the table to see if we can as they've done in baseball, break it down a bit and make the comparison fairer.
I suppose a follow-up question to that would be, have the baseball statisticians put us to shame? One can't but feel a bit of an inferiority complex when one sees how thorough and far-reaching their metrics are.
Well, I guess I don't see it quite that way. I mean, their cricket statistics are focused on different things. That's all. And also just more natural. Again, they don't have draws, so it was a natural thing to be able to say, okay, how can we look at the contribution of an individual player to a team win? For Test cricket, and not just Test cricket, for most first-class cricket, that's a really difficult question. I don't, as someone who's done some statistics, I throw up my hands kind of how you would actually get around that. But for white ball, it could work quite well.
I get the impression that there are a lot fewer variables in baseball than there are in cricket, although perhaps I'm I'm treading on sensitive turf here. I mean, turf would be the main difference, wouldn't it? Baseball's a series of full tosses, whereas cricket famously is very much determined by the state of the playing surface.
Yes, well okay, well that's that's one of the big issues, right? What has been, batsmen who bat well on bad wickets versus on so-called flat tracks and so on. I mean, we see huge debates about that, and there's utterly for that there's no equivalent in baseball at all. But in terms of the full tosses, so to speak, there's a huge variety of full tosses in baseball. They have curveballs, four seam two seam fastballs, cutters, sliders. I mean, knuckleballs. I mean, they do a lot of things with a ball that's just in the air.
Okay, just to get to Tom's second question then, he says, a very interesting bit of work, and I think there's something here that the game as a whole needs to work out, how to use advanced metrics and how we want to define them. I'm sure that there are many similar analyses that I've read in the last 10 plus years to do a similar thing. Of these, some use the game by game adjustment of average, others use error, as you have. I guess I'm wondering how all the disparate areas of the game could come together and work out a better overall answer here. Is that something we want? Kimber uses WAR, wins above replacement, for T20 more and more at the moment, for example, but is it the same as wins above replacement? Likely not.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my pitch is that I think here's another approach to doing analyses that people in the past. It doesn't mean to say index-based systems have to be thrown out, but they're all based on looking again at a batsman, a bowler, or an all-rounder. Here's an approach where you could look at the whole cricketer, and I hope that to generate sufficient interest that other people who could pick up the flag and start doing some more analysis. This is probably as far as I can take it.
And Stephen Swain has a question. Wouldn't ice hockey be a good sport for this, with time on ice and plus minus goals and assists?
I lived in Canada for the last close to 50 years. So yeah, in terms of when you see people rating hockey players, the main thing they look at is points per game. So in hockey, you can score goals, you can get assists for goals. So by far the leader in terms of total points is someone called Wayne Gretzky, and so you might say Gretzky is the Bradman equivalent. But when you look at points per game, Gretzky's only slightly better than the next player, which is a guy called Mario Lemieux. Yeah, they do have more detailed analysis, break it down by points divided by time on ice. Obviously, if you're on the ice longer, you're going to have a better chance of scoring goals or making assists. I'm not sure if that quite answers Stephen's question, but again, the interesting thing to me, which is again how the extent to which across sports Bradman is an outlier. I mean, he's just I can't find, like as I said, Gretzky on a pure points basis is about 30% higher than number two. Bradman is 60% higher than number two, who is Herbert Sutcliffe. And then you go across other sports, basketball, people who score points per game in basketball, football, I mean soccer as it's called over here, same thing. You don't see enormous gaps between the number one and the number two.
And then I think Brian had a question, more or less elaborating the point I made earlier about the vagaries of selection. He points out that a good many players' records are adversely affected by the impact of the world wars, perhaps losing their best years to those.
Yeah, again, though that comes to me under the heading of, you start with the statistics and then you have to look at other factors as well. I guess Len Hutton stands out as a player who still produced a tremendous record, whose career was very adversely affected by the Second World War. I mean, I guess it in my mind comes back to one of my peeves is recency bias. When you go on the internet, it's dominated obviously by younger people. They want to post about this, that, and the other thing, and quite invariably don't even look at people who played before 1980, and much less going back into the earlier realms of the game. I even saw one post arguing that all records before 1950 should just be washed away because there weren't enough teams. But this is all part of the landscape.
Do we have any more questions? If anyone's having trouble unmuting themselves, just raise your hand and I'll do it for you. It would be nice to have a verbal question. Okay, well then, one from me to finish off. What surprised you most among your findings? There must have been a result your metrics yielded that made you do a double take.
It's very definitely how Richard Hadley and Alan Davidson rate much higher than Davidson's hardly mentioned at all when you see it in contemporary analyses, and Hadley not so much. And again, it arises from something that's a bit controversial. It's because I'm saying they were bowlers who batted well rather than genuine all-rounders. If you refer their batting to what I use as the all-rounder reference figure, which is 30 runs, then their ratings drop quite a bit. So again, but that was a surprise that Hadley would essentially emerge as the second greatest cricketer. But then I thought about it some more, and the next level after you is to look at country by country, like home and away, and the home and away averages difference, and then how well does the player do against the best opposition of their era? And Hadley stacks up. He's someone that's sort of overlooked. I could show you if you have time. So Khan as all rounder, I'm saying his value is 28 runs. If you say he was a bowler who batted well, it jumps to 38, and then if you say he was a batsman who also bowled, it drops to 22, and then the same for all the others. So you can see there's a very strong argument that Imran Khan was the next greatest cricketer to Don Bradman. The caveat for me is what I mentioned earlier, is there's a very large discrepancy between his home and his away average. To Khan's great credit, he was one of the leading figures in bringing neutral umpiring into Pakistan. Nevertheless, he clearly benefited from putatively biased umpiring.
Right.
He's not the only, but I also should mention, I just tremendous sympathy for the man right now. I mean, my overall impression is of Khan as a man of enormous integrity, as shown by his champion of neutral umpires. And there he is languishing in jail politically. I know there's been a strong move recently by cricketers to try to intervene, and hopefully that will bear some fruit. I did a quick look at. I compared from 60 to 80. I looked at three countries: Australia, England, and Pakistan, in terms of the number of LBW decisions given against their batsmen versus opposition. England was completely unbiased over that period. It was exactly the same number. Australia was a 10% bias to Australian batsmen. Pakistan, it was double. It was 100% more LBW dismissal between 60 and 80. So I mean that is what it is. But in terms of looking at great Pakistani cricketers, it's not something that I find I can turn a blind eye to.
We've got a question from John Bryan.
Yes, thank you, Rodney, and thank you to Russ for a fascinating exposition. I wanted to make two comments actually. One about Pakistan, and the other about the overall scheme that Russ has set out. If I could do Pakistan first. I've always thought that Pakistan got a very bad press in the 1980s on umpiring issues. There was it wasn't just Imran Khan that was pressing for neutral umpires. I think from 1980, the Pakistan board was pressing very hard for neutral umpires in all tests. And, initially their representations were dismissed in what I thought was quite a high-handed way, and all of this stuff about English umpires are the best in the world. Why wouldn't you want to have English umpires? I've yet to meet anybody from Australia or New Zealand or India who agrees with the proposition, incidentally, that English umpires are the best in the world. It seems to be a view that is very strongly held in England. But Pakistan's treatment at the hands of the English authorities around the 86-87 period was high-handed and patronising in the extreme. So Pakistan objected to, on their tour in 86, I think it was, or 87, they attempted to object to some of the English home umpires, especially David Constant, and their dismissals were ridden roughshod over by the English authorities. So it wasn't very surprising when a few months later England went on tour in Pakistan, tried to object to some of the Pakistan umpires nominated by Pakistan, and seemed completely astonished when the Pakistanis took exactly the same line and completely dismissed their representation. So this is not this is quite a nuanced issue, and I do think that Pakistan, although obviously a deplorable situation had been arrived at, with the gassing in the Faisalabad dust, wagging his finger at the umpire, it was by no means all of Pakistan's doing, and I think the English authorities contributed very much to that situation. But anyway, sorry, let me not rant on about Pakistan umpires. The other thing I wanted to say is that although it's a very it's a fascinating package that you put forward. But one of the things that I have to say does trouble me is that players' rankings are so much, depend so much on whether they are classified as, for example, a bowler that bats, a batter that bowls, or a genuine all-round. There must be lots of players that are really on the cusp. Is there any way, Russ, that it would be possible to have a system that doesn't involve this kind of categorization of cricketers, but simply looks at the cricketers' overall performance? Cricketers actually drift between these categories across their career. Wilfred Rhodes being a spectacular example. He started as a bowler who hardly batted at all. He evolved into an all-rounder. Then he became a batter and didn't bowl very much. And then in his late career, he took to bowling again. So, cricketers drift between these categories. And I don't know how you capture that if you're going to categorize players in this way.
I think what I would say is the framework I've developed allows you to decide for yourself. I mean, what it boils down to is you have to decide a reference value for the bowling average and the batting average. As I showed with the table with the other obvious all-rounders, you can do a sensitivity analysis and see how that turns out. The obvious thing to do would be to, for everybody, batsman or bowler, to the long-run average of 30.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, and so I've done that actually, and I didn't this. So you can do that, but but on the other hand, the other is you should, if you like, the proper comparison should be by batting position, not the broad category, because it makes a big difference, right? But again, the framework allows you to do all of those yourself. I'm not imposing any, just providing a framework. You could put in your own reference average, see what that does, make your judgments accordingly.
All right, questions are coming thick and fast now. I think we have one from Robbie.
Oh, hello. Thank you. Thank you both for absolutely fascinating conversation. Marvellous. I wanted to go back and touch briefly on what was discussed at the beginning, at the early questions. In relation to how one ascertains a value judgment on a player, having regard to selections and eras, and more importantly, in my view, the matter of when they play and how long before and after their peak they carry on. I'm not disputing for one moment that anyone who denigrates Bradman is, in a sense, doing no service to all the other great players who were his exact contemporaries, because if you denigrate Bradman and you want to reduce his average from 99.94 because he can't bat on a wet wicket on the few occasions he's had to, and you bring him down to 75 or 80, then where does that leave wonderful players like Headley, Hammond, McKay, Ponsford, etc.? So I'm not in any way trying to denigrate Bradman here, but I've always maintained that there is one other player who, admittedly not in Test cricket because that came too early for the bulk of his or for the peak of his career, but with regard to first-class cricket, in the same way that Bradman is so much better than even his great contemporaries. W.G. Grace, if he hadn't started as a 16-year-old batting on rather poor wickets and carried on for 25 years after his fabulous peak, he would have had figures as stupendous as Bradman, in the sense that if you compare Bradman to, say, Headley and Hammond and Sutcliffe, WG was as far ahead for, say, the years 1870 to 1880 as any other player of that period. He was incredibly far ahead. But of course, people will look at WG now and they'll say, oh, well, A, he's large and slow, B, he wears a silly cap, and C, he only averaged 39 point something. What's the point of trying to rate him in comparison with other great players? I'm wondering, is there something that, even if you don't agree specifically about WG, who I use as this example, is there anything in your methodology, which would help to give a balance between players who start so early that they're prejudiced in terms of figures, and then carry on so far into their career that they ruin the great career figures that they did have, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think I do agree about W.G. Grace. Just a little bit parenthetical. The article that will appear in the May issue of the Cricket Statistician by a Dr. Bowie. He has this. He ranks everyone as if they were all rounders. So it's a ranking scheme. So even on the basis of the figures we have, which as you say quite correctly, Grace was what he was 36 when he started playing Test cricket. His Test record doesn't look that good. It does when you actually put it in comparison. It said the averages for that era before 1920 changed from year to year, and if you make the proper adjustment, Grace even looks good there. But anyhow, the point of this art is that Grace emerges by his ranking scheme to be the greatest cricketer. I have a lot of sympathy for just the general view that the Grace was likely the greatest cricketer, but to show it statistically, it would require a lot of. You have to go back and look at those first class records and make the relevant adjustments and so on. I think that's how you would apply the same approach that I've outlined here to Grace.